Welcome back. We're at this is the third day of notes in this exploration unit packet, so you should have totally finished everything in exploration day 1 and should have finished all of this stuff in day 2 about the Aztec and Incas, including all the maps. So the last map you did was this one. And now we are up to where it says the Atlantic slave trade right here. So, we've already talked a little bit about this stuff in class, but let's look at this. So, got a little triangle here. The slave trade is part of something called the triangle trade. So the slaves come from Africa to the Americas. They produce things that go back to Europe, and then the Europeans are going to sell the things they make to the Africans, and that's how they're going to get more slaves to start the whole thing over again. So, why did they need labor in the New World? So we've seen this a little bit. The two big things were sugar and tobacco farms. Those are called plantations here in Virginia. When they start the colonize Virginia, we're going to do tobacco, but like all of those Caribbean islands are predominantly sugar, though they also do tobacco. They become known mostly for sugar. They're going to start with Native Americans and move on to using Africans for slaves. So with the Native Americans, and we already saw this, they're the first ones who get enslaved, but they are exposed to these diseases, which you've seen in class. Most of them are going to die from that. On top of that, the Spanish have some wars with these local tribes and mistreatment of the slaves. They're not really treated well. So they just end up with too much trouble. It's too much trouble to keep them, and they're sick and they die. One other aspect of this is, once they escaped, it's hard to track them down because they could blend in with the rest of either their tribe or another native tribe. It'd be hard for the Spanish to figure out whether they were an escaped slave or if they were just one of the local people. So it's not going to work out, and they're going to pretty quickly move on to African slave labor that is mostly being sold to them by the Portuguese, but then the Spanish are going to get involved in that as well. So, the benefits of using Africans for slaves. Africa's close to Europe, so they built up immunities to these diseases that had killed off a lot of the natives, which we saw a video about that. They also are just better suited to do this farm labor. They're from Africa, where it's the same latitude, so the temperatures, if you come straight across from Africa to South America, are going to be similar. And a lot of these people had been doing hard, heavy labor back in Africa, so it's an easy transition for them, just in terms of doing the work. Benefit of using the Africans. Africans look different than the Spanish and the natives, so if they are not on their plantation doing their work, it's easy to spot this is a person who is not supposed to be here. Because you would have Spanish and natives walking around everywhere, but if you saw an African person, they would stick out and you would know these guys are supposed to be back on one of the plantations. So, how did they get these slaves? So, the natives, they obviously got just by going in and taking over the local village or kidnapping them from a local village. Getting the slaves from Africa is a bigger deal. Obviously, if a bunch of Europeans hop off a boat and try to go into the middle of Africa, that is going to be a very short trip. The local African rulers are going to shut them down. So, the way they had to get these Africans is from other Africans, especially the western coast of Africa, the closest to Portugal and Spain. They had trade posts set up. If you've seen the movie Amistad, it's a very good depiction of how all of this happens. But the short version is, the Europeans would sail up, there were forts built on the coast to sell things to these Europeans. So they would sail up, they'd have these slaves already captured, and you just bid on which of these slaves you wanted. So the African tribes would go catch other Africans, usually from a tribe they didn't like or that they had had trouble with, and they would sell those people into slavery, and then they would not only weaken their rival that lived nearby them, but they would get money for that. So this is generating a lot of money for the Africans who are selling the slaves, and is also keeping their enemies weak. And this is a depiction of Africans leading Africans to these slave markets. You can notice right here, it's an African guy, but he has got this weapon that's from Europe. It's one of the things they traded for slaves, is they have these nice rifles, well, what eventually become rifles, but modern guns that they can sell them. They also give them rum from the sugar that, ironically, these slaves are about to produce over in the Americas in exchange for these slaves. So the guns are nice because they give them power. The money's nice because it makes them rich, which also gives them power. And the hard thing for us to keep in mind is the Africans did not think of themselves as the same. They were from different countries, so we do not think of ourselves as being the same as somebody from Cuba or Mexico or Canada. And these Africans also did not think of themselves as being the same as these other tribes. They were foreign people to them, and they had no problem treating them poorly the same way we treat other countries poorly fairly often. So, if you look at this map, you can see we've got tons and tons of slaves being sold up and down this coast. It's the easiest coast to get to for the Europeans. Remember, it was dangerous to go along the southern tip here through the Cape of Good Hope. It also took longer. So if you sail here, the way back to the Americas is through these islands. So if you come down here, it's actually really short. That's the shortest trip back to South America, which, by the way, is where about 90% of the slaves go to South America, to the Spanish colonies. We think of slavery as being something from the southern United States, where we have had plantations, but the vast majority, 90-something%, end up in the areas south of North America, way more than anywhere else in South America, working on these giant sugar and tobacco plantations. Which leads us to the triangle trade. So in your packet, you're going to have a little map to do about this, so make sure you've got this. So we got a little nice interactive thing here. So from Europe to Africa, we got manufactured goods, and guns is one of the big things that they're giving to the Africans. Africans are going to put slaves on their ships in exchange. So put that on your map. So Europe is known as the Old World. They're going to Africa, particularly this western coast here that you just saw. They're getting slaves in exchange for manufactured goods, things they have made, and one of these things is guns. Another big one was rum. So those are things they can't make themselves. Now, from Africa, mostly slaves, but also gold, because the Europeans were really after gold as well. They're going to take the slaves and gold and take it to the Americas. Okay? And then from the Americas, they are going to send back. The big ones were sugar, tobacco, molasses is made from sugar. And then over here, and cotton. They're going to turn these things into the item you actually want. So cigars and clothing and rum, as well as other things. So the colonists are giving them the raw good, and they are turning it into a manufactured good. Now, the trip from Africa for the slaves in this triangle trade is called the Middle Passage. So it's literally, we'll look back at this, is literally this trip. So the slaves get on a boat. This trip to here, or up here, or up here, wherever they end up in the Americas, this trip across the Atlantic is called the Middle Passage. It's the trip that the ships full of slaves took to North and South America. Now, the effects on Africa. These are the official SOL effects. There's obviously more. The effects on Africa is they are losing some of the best physical bodies from Africa, because those are the ones you want working on your farm. I know it sounds awful, but you have to think of this in the same way you would think of a farmer buying an animal to work on his farm. He wants the biggest, strongest, and youngest body. He doesn't want a 40-year-old. He wants a 16-year-old that he's going to get 20 years of really good physical work out of. So taking away labor and soldiers and things like that they could use in the future, but it's also giving some tribes an advantage by giving them guns. So the tribe with the guns is now going to be able to attack the tribes with no guns and have a big advantage over them. Now, over here in America. And remember, when we say America, we're talking mostly South America. At the end is when, about halfway through really, is when North America really gets on this plan with everybody else. But in America, these Africans are doing backbreaking labor. That's why they are doing it. It's not something that Europeans would want to do. You could not pay them to do this. It's worse than where they were coming from, so they would rather stay and be farmers in Europe. The other thing is, and this is a positive, is you have cultural diffusion, which you learned about in World History 1. So these cultures in Africa are coming over to America, and new ideas from these cultures are being spread to us. In the United States, the greatest example was probably Charleston. It's the biggest harbor in the South. You've got these African and Caribbeans that are coming there. Some of them end up free black people in the South. And just new ideas are coming in. So you don't just have this English ideas and cultures, and you don't just have French culture in the French colonies and Spanish culture in the Spanish colonies. It makes it into a big mixture. All right, so that's it for today. You need to make sure you got that map on the triangle trade completed. And next time we will be talking about just pure economics of the age of exploration.